I don't believe in luck. I believe in load-bearing capacity. If you want to know if a person or a project will collapse, you don't look at the surface. You look at the foundation. My foundation was laid in a small, cramped apartment, fueled by the silence of a man who didn't look back when he left. My father walked out 15 years ago, and I spent every day since learning how to build something so solid he couldn't possibly be part of it. I am Zara James, and I am an architect. I don't design to decorate, I design to survive. I had spent a decade refining my aesthetic, minimalist, brutal, and precise. When I accepted the junior associate position at Wells & Associates, it wasn't because I wanted a job. It was because they were the best, and I had a decade of built-up, cold fury that needed a high-stakes outlet. I was finally in the room where the city's skyline was decided. The office was a testament to Catherine Wells's vision, floor-to-ceiling glass, polished concrete, and a silence so heavy it felt like a structural element. I walked into the conference room for the intake meeting, my portfolio perfectly aligned on the mahogany surface. I was ready to prove that my resume wasn't just a collection of scholarships, it was a weapon. Then the door opened. Catherine Wells entered. She was the firm's heart, a woman whose name was carved into the glass of every major project in the city. She was dressed in sharp, architectural lines, moving with a grace that was entirely unearned. I didn't need to check her background. I knew that face from the photographs my mother had hidden in a shoebox for years. She was the elegant complication that had ended my family. She walked to the head of the table, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced detachment of someone who owned the view. She paused on me for a fraction of a second, her expression neutral. She didn't see the 16-year-old girl who had watched her father choose a stranger over his own blood. She saw a junior associate. The irony was structural. I had spent 15 years building a career specifically to reach the pinnacle of this industry, only to find the woman who had burned my house down standing at the top of the stairs. My pulse didn't spike. My breathing didn't falter. I simply calculated the distance between where I was standing and the power she wielded. I was in her house. I was looking at her blueprints. I realized then that I wouldn't be quitting. I had spent too long learning how to identify the weak point in a structure, and I had just found the one in hers. I don't sketch, I calculate. In architecture, a line isn't just a mark, it's a commitment of weight and tension. For my first week at Wells & Associates, I treated every assignment like a structural stress test. I arrived at 6:00 a.m., my coffee black and my focus absolute. I wanted Catherine Wells to see my talent before she ever had the chance to see my face. I wanted her to depend on my precision before she realized whose blood was running through my veins. The project was a high-profile museum extension in the West Loop. It was a mess of glass angles and impossible cantilevers. Catherine sat at the head of the drafting table, her fingers tracing the vellum with a familiarity that made my skin crawl. "This corner is dead," she said, her voice a low, melodic rasp. "There's no soul in the transition. It's technically perfect, but it doesn't breathe." The other associates shrunk back, but I stepped forward. I didn't look at her eyes, I looked at the blueprint. "The transition isn't dead," I said, my voice as flat and hard as a granite slab. "It's honest. You're trying to force a curve where the structural load demands a sharp edge. You're prioritizing the aesthetic over the truth of the materials." The room went silent. You don't tell Catherine Wells she's being dishonest with materials. She looked up, her sharp, elegant features tightening as she studied me. For a second, a flicker of something passed over her face, a ghost of a memory. She wasn't seeing a junior associate. She was seeing a shadow of the man she had loved 15 years ago. My father had the same stubborn adherence to the truth of the wood. "James, isn't it?" she asked, her gaze lingering a second too long. "Your work is reminiscent of a specific school of thought, one I haven't seen in a very long time. You have a spark, Zara, but sparks can burn a building down if they aren't contained." She left the room, leaving a vacuum of tension behind her. I waited until the office emptied for the night, the city lights beginning to bleed through the glass walls. I needed to know how deep the rot went. I made my way to the physical archives in the basement, a place of dust and forgotten dreams. I began pulling files from 2011, the year the firm was founded. My breath hitched as I pulled a heavy, black binder from the bottom shelf. It wasn't a project file. It was a partnership agreement. Tucked inside the back cover was a handwritten sketch on a cocktail napkin, a rough draft of the firm's original logo. In the bottom corner, the initials weren't CW, they were AJ. Arthur James, my father. The firm hadn't just been built by Catherine. It had been stolen. I stood in the dark, the cold paper of the archive file biting into my palms, realizing that the woman upstairs hadn't just taken my father. She had taken his legacy, and she was currently using it to pay my salary. The architecture of a lie is surprisingly delicate. If you remove one structural support, the whole facade remains standing for a while, held up by nothing but momentum and habit. That was how I felt walking into the office the next morning. The black binder from the archives was burned into my retinas. Arthur James. My father wasn't just the man who left. He was the ghost who had co-authored the very walls I was standing in. Catherine Wells sat in her glass-walled corner office, a silhouette of predatory elegance against the Chicago skyline. She looked like a woman who had built a kingdom, but I now knew she had built it on stolen ground. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I practiced the architecture of silence. I sat at my workstation and began a subtle, high-stakes campaign of professional sabotage. I was assigned to the structural load calculations for the West Loop Museum's glass atrium. It was a masterpiece of tension and light. I began to introduce ghost errors, calculations that were technically sound on paper, but would create a harmonic resonance in high winds. It wouldn't make the building fall, but it would make it hum. A low, irritating vibration that would drive any tenant mad. It was a signature of incompetence that would point directly to Catherine's final approval. "Zara," Catherine's voice cut through my focused malice. She was standing behind me, her reflection ghosting over my computer screen. "Your work on the atrium is aggressive. I like the tension, but you're pushing the glass to its absolute limit. Why?" I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the digital wireframe. "Because limits are the only things that matter, Catherine. If you don't test the breaking point, you don't really know what you're standing on." She stayed there for a moment too long. I could feel her studying the back of my neck, perhaps looking for a mole or a hairline that mirrored the man she once loved. "You have his hands," she whispered, so low I almost missed it. "His precision, but you have a coldness he never possessed. Arthur was soft. He let things slip through his fingers." My blood turned to liquid nitrogen. She was talking about him as if he were a failed draft, a discarded sketch. I turned my chair slowly, meeting her gaze with a professional mask that felt like it was made of iron. "I wouldn't know. I prefer materials that don't break under pressure." She didn't flinch. Instead, she handed me a thick, cream-colored envelope. The firm's charitable foundation is hosting a gala for our scholarship recipients. You were a beneficiary of the Founding Partners Fund for 10 years, Zara. It's time you met the people who paid for your seat at this table. I waited until she left before I ripped the envelope open. Inside wasn't an invitation. It was a ledger summary of the scholarship fund. The donor wasn't a corporation. It was a private trust. I felt the floor tilt beneath me as I traced the account numbers back to Catherine's personal holdings. The woman who stole my father hadn't just taken his legacy. She had been quietly buying my future, one semester at a time, for a decade. Money is the ultimate structural reinforcement. It can bridge gaps that logic cannot, and it can hide cracks in a foundation until the entire building is ready to drop. I stared at the ledger in the dim light of my workstation, the numbers blurring into a map of my own life. Every tuition payment, every textbook, every late-night meal during my master's program, it hadn't come from a faceless committee. It had come from Catherine Wells's private account. The calculus of guilt was staggering. She hadn't just replaced my father, she had replaced his responsibility. I felt a surge of nausea. To Catherine, I wasn't an architect, I was a project. A penance. A line item on a balance sheet intended to offset the debt of a family she had helped dismantle. I didn't wait for the gala. I walked straight into her office, the glass door clicking shut behind me with a sound like a guillotine. She didn't look up from her sketches. She was tracing the cantilever of the West Loop Museum with a silver drafting pencil, her movements fluid and calm. "The scholarship, Catherine," I said, my voice cutting through the climate-controlled air. "Why? Did you think a few $100,000 would make the silence at my dinner table sound any different for 15 years? She finally looked up. There was no surprise in her eyes, only a weary, professional resignation. She laid the pencil down with agonizing precision. "I didn't think it would change the past, Zara. I'm an architect. I know that once a structure is demolished, you don't get the original materials back. You just try to build something functional on the ruins." "You took him," I spat, the clean, cold rage finally breaking the surface. "You took the only man who was supposed to stand by me, and then you tried to buy my loyalty from the shadows. Is that how you built this firm? By finding people's weaknesses and paying for them?" Catherine stood up, walking toward the floor-to-ceiling window. She looked out at the city she had helped shape, her reflection appearing ghost-like over the skyline. "I didn't take Arthur, Zara. I accepted him. And 6 months later, I realized I had inherited a man who was hollow. He didn't leave your mother for me. He left her because he couldn't handle the weight of being a father. When I realized that, I threw him out. He didn't go back to you, did he? He just vanished." She turned to face me, her expression unreadable. "I didn't fund your scholarship because I wanted your loyalty. I did it because I saw your first portfolio when you were 18. You had his talent, but you had your mother's spine. I wanted to see what that combination could build. If you want to throw the money back at me, do it. But don't pretend you didn't earn every cent of it on your own merit." I stood there, my hands balled into fists, the primary conflict shifting beneath my feet. I had spent 15 years hating a thief, only to find out I was looking at a witness to a much deeper cowardice. The architecture of a memory is often a lie we tell ourselves to stay upright. I had built my entire identity on the belief that Catherine Wells was the thief who stole my father, the villain who dismantled my childhood brick by brick. But as I stood in her office, the city lights of Chicago flickering like dying nerves behind her. That structure was beginning to groan under the weight of a new, uglier truth. "He didn't go back to you," Catherine had said. The words were a structural failure in my own narrative. I left her office without a word, my heels clicking a frantic, hollow rhythm against the polished concrete. I didn't go home. I went back to the basement, back to the archives where the skeletons of Wells and Associates were filed in acid-free folders. I needed the definitive proof. If Catherine was lying about Arthur James, about his cowardice, about his disappearance, I would find the paper trail. I tore through the private foundation records, my fingers stained with the ink of a decade of anonymous philanthropy. I found the bank transfers, the routing numbers, and the tuition receipts. But then I found something else. Tucked into a file labeled Discontinued Partnerships, 2012 was a legal settlement. It was a non-disclosure agreement signed by my father 6 months after he left us. In exchange for a massive payout from Catherine's personal inheritance, he had agreed to waive all intellectual property rights to the firm's original designs. But there was a rider, a handwritten addendum. "I, Arthur James, hereby relinquish all claims to the firm and all future contact with any parties associated with the James Wells legacy, provided the lump sum is transferred to a private offshore account." The date on the transfer was 2 days before my 17th birthday, the day I had waited by the window for a card that never came. He hadn't been kept from me. He hadn't been stolen. He had been bought out, and he had taken the price of my childhood to disappear into a life of luxury while my mother worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on. I leaned against the cold metal shelving of the archive, the air in the basement feeling thin and metallic. Catherine hadn't been the architect of his absence. She had simply been the one who paid for the silence so she could build something clean out of the mess he left behind. She had spent 15 years funding my education, not out of a calculus of guilt for taking him, but out of a profound, silent pity for the girl he had sold for a check. I looked at my hands, his hands. The precision I was so proud of felt like a curse. I realized then that the glass shatters moment isn't when you see the enemy. It's when you realize the person you were protecting was the one who pulled the trigger. I grabbed the file and headed for the elevator. It was time to stop being a junior associate and start being the architect of a different kind of ending. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like an ascent through a vacuum. In my hand, the settlement agreement crinkled, a paper ghost of the man I had spent 15 years trying to impress. I walked into Catherine's office without knocking. She was still there, silhouetted against the indigo Chicago sky, a glass of scotch untouched on her desk. She didn't turn around. She didn't have to. "He sold me," I said, my voice echoing off the minimalist surfaces. "He didn't just leave. He took a buyout. For 17 years, I thought you were the thief, but you were just the liquidator." Catherine turned slowly. The formidable mask she wore for the world was gone, replaced by a weary, structural fatigue. "I offered him a partnership, Zara. I offered him a seat at the table. He asked for the cash instead. He said a family was a sunk cost he couldn't afford to carry anymore." The justice I had come for, the cold, calculated destruction of Catherine Wells, was suddenly irrelevant. You can't demolish a building that's already hollow. My rage, once a clean and sharp tool, had become a heavy, useless weight. I looked at the woman who had spent a decade paying for my textbooks and realized she wasn't my enemy. She was my silent co-conspirator in a tragedy I hadn't understood. "Why the scholarship?" I asked, the one lingering question finally breaking through. "If he was a coward, why didn't you just let us drown? Why did you keep my mother and me afloat from the shadows?" Catherine walked toward me, her heels silent on the silk rug. She stopped just inches away, her eyes searching mine, looking for the man she once loved and finding only the woman she had helped create. "Because I knew what he took from you," she whispered, "and I wanted to see if his daughter was made of the same cheap materials he was. I wanted to see if you would break under the weight of the world or if you would build something on top of it." I looked down at the blueprints on her desk. The West Loop Museum. My ghost errors were still there, hidden in the calculations. I reached out, picked up a drafting pencil, and with 3 swift, precise strokes, I corrected the harmonic resonance. I fixed the vibration. I stabilized the structure. "I'm not leaving," I said, meeting her gaze with a clarity that felt like reinforced steel. "But I'm not your project anymore. I'm the partner my father was too weak to be." Transformation isn't about forgetting the past. It's about repurposing the ruins. As I walked out of the office, I felt the architecture of truth settling into my bones. Hatred required a simplicity that the truth kept interrupting. But as I passed the mailroom, I saw a single, hand-addressed envelope sitting in the out tray. It was addressed to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The money hadn't stopped flowing, but this time it wasn't coming from Catherine.